The folding chair creaked beneath me as I shifted forward. My daughter Melody's name printed in gold letters across the graduation program, trembling slightly in my hands. Around me, hundreds of families filled the Willowbrook Academy auditorium, their excited chatter echoing off the vaulted ceiling as they waited for the ceremony to begin. I smoothed down my navy dress, simple, professional, nothing flashy, and tried to ignore the familiar knot forming in my stomach as I spotted them, 3 rows ahead. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Marcus, my ex-husband, sat surrounded by his family like some kind of royal court. His mother, Vivienne Blackwell, wore what looked like a designer suit that probably cost more than my monthly rent, her silver hair perfectly coiffed despite the humid June weather. Next to her, Marcus's sister Charlotte adjusted her Hermès scarf and whispered something to their cousin Patricia, both of them glancing back at me with those practiced smiles that never quite reached their eyes. Marcus himself looked every inch the successful pharmaceutical executive he'd become, his Armani suit crisp, his Rolex catching the auditorium lights as he checked the time with theatrical importance. They hadn't noticed me yet, but I knew they would. They always did. For 18 years, every school event had been the same dance. They'd arrive in their luxury cars, make their grand entrance, and somehow manage to turn every celebration of Melody's achievements into a subtle reminder of what I supposedly lacked. Parent-teacher conferences, science fairs, soccer games, it didn't matter. Vivienne would ask about my little job, with that perfectly practiced concern. Charlotte would mention Marcus's latest promotion or bonus, and Patricia would share updates about her children's private tutors and European vacations, all while I sat there in my off-the-rack clothes, representing the other side of Melody's family. Today was supposed to be different. Today was Melody's high school graduation from one of the most prestigious private academies in Cedarmont Valley, and she was graduating as valedictorian. My daughter, brilliant, determined, kind, had earned every honor, every scholarship, every opportunity that lay ahead of her. Today was her day, and I'd promised myself I wouldn't let their subtle digs and barely concealed condescension ruin it. But as the lights dimmed and Principal Harrison took the stage, I heard Vivienne's voice carry across the rows with that particular tone she used when she wanted to sound concerned, but really just wanted to be cruel. "I still can't believe Melody turned down Harvard for state school," she was saying to Charlotte, just loud enough for the families around us to hear. "I mean, I understand financial limitations, but surely there were other options. Marcus offered to help, but you know how stubborn Diana can be about accepting reality." My hands tightened on the program. Reality. As if my daughter's decision to accept a full scholarship to Cedarmont State University instead of taking on crushing debt at an Ivy League school was somehow a failure instead of a smart financial choice. Charlotte's response was even worse. "Well, what can you expect? Diana's always been so limited in her perspective, still working that little administrative job at the community center, right? Some people just don't have the vision to see beyond their circumstances." Administrative job. They made it sound like I was filing papers and answering phones, not running programs that had transformed lives and brought millions in grant funding to our community. But then again, they'd never bothered to actually ask what I did for work. They'd made their assumptions 18 years ago and never bothered to update them. "I just worry about Melody's future," Vivienne continued, her voice dripping with false concern. When you come from, well, when one side of the family has such different values about success and ambition, it can be limiting. Thank goodness she has Marcus's influence to balance things out. That's when Patricia chimed in with the comment that would change everything. "At least she's smart enough to know which side of the family to model herself after. I mean, Diana's sweet and all, but let's be honest, working at a community center isn't exactly preparing Melody for the real world. Good thing she has us to show her what actual success looks like." The three of them shared a quiet laugh, the kind that said they thought they were being clever and subtle. Around us, other families shifted uncomfortably, some shooting apologetic glances in my direction, but I didn't move. I sat perfectly still, my hands steady on the program, my face composed, even as something fundamental shifted inside me. They had no idea. They had no idea that the little administrative job they'd been mocking for 18 years had been my cover story. They had no idea that while they were gossiping about my limitations, I was the reason their granddaughter and niece was graduating from this school at all. They had no idea that every scholarship program Melody had benefited from, every advanced placement course that had prepared her for college, every academic opportunity that had shaped her into the valedictorian about to take the stage, all of it existed because of the limited woman they'd just dismissed as irrelevant. But they were about to find out. Because in about 20 minutes, Principal Harrison would take the stage to announce this year's keynote speaker and recognize the Academy's most generous benefactor, the woman whose anonymous donations over the past 15 years had funded the very auditorium we sat in, the scholarship programs that had supported hundreds of students, and the academic excellence initiatives that had made Willowbrook Academy one of the top schools in the state. They thought they knew who I was. They thought they understood my place in their family's story. They were wrong about everything. And today, on my daughter's graduation day, with hundreds of witnesses present and cameras rolling, they were going to learn exactly who Diana Chen really was, and just how spectacular their mistake had been. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. As Principal Harrison adjusted the microphone and the auditorium fell into respectful silence, I reached into my purse and pulled out my phone. My fingers moved with practiced precision, opening the secure email app that connected me directly to the Willowbrook Academy Board of Trustees, the same app I'd been using for 15 years to coordinate donations, approve funding requests, and oversee the scholarship programs that had quietly transformed this school. 3 quick taps brought up the message I'd prepared this morning. Sitting in my kitchen with my coffee as I listened to the local news praising Willowbrook's record-breaking graduation class and unprecedented college acceptance rates, the message was simple, professional, and about to change everything. To Board of Trustees, Willowbrook Academy. From D. Chen, Cedarmont Foundation. R.E. Public Acknowledgement. Authorization. Effective immediately, I am authorizing the public disclosure of my identity as the primary benefactor of Willowbrook Academy. Please proceed with today's planned recognition ceremony as discussed. All previous requests for anonymity are hereby rescinded. Best regards, Diana Chen, founder and director, Cedarmont Foundation. I hit send and slipped the phone back into my purse, my hands steady despite the magnitude of what I'd just set in motion. Around me, families were settling in for what they expected to be a standard graduation ceremony. The Blackwell family was still whispering among themselves, probably planning their next subtle dig about my circumstances or preparing to monopolize Melody during the reception afterward. They had no idea that in my purse, alongside that phone, sat documents that would rewrite everything they thought they knew. The incorporation papers for the Cedarmont Foundation, established the year after my divorce when Marcus's settlement had given me exactly what I needed to disappear into anonymity and build something meaningful. The bank statements showing the $50 million in donations I'd funneled through carefully structured trusts over the past decade and a half. The architectural plans bearing my signature for the very building we sat in. Plans I'd personally approved and funded after the old auditorium was damaged in the flood of 2018. But most importantly, tucked behind those documents was the letter I'd written to Melody last night and planned to give her after the ceremony. The letter explaining why I'd kept our family's true circumstances hidden, why I'd let the Blackwell family believe their narrative about my limitations, and why I'd chosen to live modestly while quietly building one of the most influential educational, Foundations in the State. My dearest Melody, it began. By the time you read this, you'll understand why I never corrected your father's family when they assumed I was just getting by. Why I drove the same Honda for 8 years when I could have afforded anything. Why I shopped at Target when they shopped at Nordstrom. Why I let them pity me when I was actually funding the very opportunities they praised you for achieving. I wanted you to grow up knowing that worth isn't measured by designer labels or luxury cars. That success isn't about making others feel small, but about lifting others up. That real power is quiet, purposeful, and doesn't need an audience to matter. Today, that changes. Today, you'll see what I really built with the gifts your father never valued. Today, you'll understand that every scholarship you earned was one I created. Every program that challenged you was one I funded. Every opportunity that shaped you was one I made possible. I'm tired of letting small people feel big at our expense. You're graduating as valedictorian from one of the finest schools in the country, and you deserve to know that your mother helped build the very excellence you've achieved. Principal Harrison's voice cut through my thoughts as he began the opening remarks. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Willowbrook Academy's 127th commencement ceremony. Before we begin recognizing our graduates, I have the extraordinary honor of finally acknowledging someone who has made this day, and countless others, like it, possible. I watched Vivienne Blackwell lean forward slightly, probably expecting another generic thank you to parents and faculty. Charlotte was checking her phone, already bored. Marcus was scanning the crowd, no doubt looking for business contacts he could schmooze during the reception. None of them were paying attention to the small tablet Principal Harrison had placed on the podium. The same tablet he'd used in countless private meetings with me over the years, reviewing budget proposals and expansion plans. The tablet that contained the presentation he'd been asking permission to give for over a decade. 15 years ago, Principal Harrison continued, his voice carrying easily through the state-of-the-art sound system I'd personally funded. Willowbrook Academy was struggling. We had aging facilities, limited resources, and were losing talented students to better-funded institutions. That year, we received our first anonymous donation from someone who would change the trajectory of this school forever. A murmur rippled through the audience. Anonymous donations were common enough, but Principal Harrison's tone suggested something bigger was coming. I felt my phone buzz with a text from Dr. Sarah Martinez, the head of the Board of Trustees and one of the few people who'd known my identity from the beginning. Are you absolutely sure about this, Diana? Once we do this, there's no going back to anonymity. I typed back quickly. I've been ready for 15 years. My daughter deserves to graduate knowing the truth. On stage, Principal Harrison was pulling up the first slide of his presentation. Over the past decade and a half, this anonymous benefactor has donated over $50 million to Willowbrook Academy. They've funded our new science laboratories, our arts wing, our athletic facilities, and this very auditorium you're sitting in today. $50 million. I watched the number land on the families around me, saw the shocked glances and whispered calculations. 3 rows ahead, Vivienne Blackwell had stopped fidgeting with her jewelry and was actually paying attention for the first time all morning. But more than buildings and equipment, Principal Harrison continued, this benefactor has funded the scholarship programs that have supported over 300 students, including 47 of today's graduates. They've created the academic excellence initiatives that have made us one of the top-ranked private schools in the region. They've invested not just in facilities, but in futures. My phone buzzed again. This time it was from my assistant at the foundation. The press is here. Channel 7, the Cedarmont Tribune, and 3 education blogs. Are you ready for this to go public? I've been ready since the day Marcus told me I'd never amount to anything, I replied, because that's what this was really about. Not just the Blackwell family's casual cruelty today, but 18 years of being dismissed, underestimated, and treated like the consolation prize in my daughter's life. 18 years of watching them take credit for Melody's achievements while never bothering to ask how those achievements were actually possible. Today, Principal Harrison said, his voice building with emotion, we finally have permission to publicly thank this remarkable individual. A woman who has proven that true philanthropy isn't about recognition or tax breaks. It's about believing in the power of education to transform lives. I stood up, not dramatically, not with fanfare. I simply rose from my folding chair, smoothed down my navy dress, and began walking toward the stage. Around me, confusion rippled through the crowd as people tried to understand what was happening. But 3 rows ahead, I saw the exact moment Vivienne Blackwell's face changed from confusion to recognition, to something that looked like terror. She finally understood who had been sitting behind them all along. The auditorium seemed to stretch endlessly as I made my way down the aisle, but my mind was already 20 years in the past, back to the day I first met Marcus Blackwell at Cedarmont University's business school orientation. I was 22, a scholarship kid from the east side of town who'd worked 3 jobs to pay for everything my academic funding didn't cover. He was 24, confident, already talking about the pharmaceutical empire his family expected him to inherit. I should have known then. Should have recognized the way he introduced me to his friends. This is Diana, she's really smart. Never, this is my girlfriend Diana, or Diana's studying international business. Just, she's really smart, like intelligence was my only notable feature, a party trick that amused him, but I was young and stupidly in love, and when Marcus proposed during our senior year, I thought I was Cinderella getting her prince. The engagement party at the Blackwell estate in Thornfield Heights was my first real glimpse into their world, and my first taste of how they saw me. How wonderful that Marcus found someone so grounded, Vivienne had said that night, her smile sharp as crystal as she surveyed my department store dress. It's important for ambitious men to have wives who understand their place in the relationship. Even then, the warning signs were flashing like neon. But I was too busy being grateful. Grateful to be chosen. Grateful to belong somewhere. Grateful that someone like Marcus could love someone like me. My own parents had died in a car accident my sophomore year, leaving me with nothing but their medical debt and a fierce determination to prove I could make something of myself. The Blackwell family's wealth and stability felt like safety after years of uncertainty. The wedding was everything I'd never dared to dream of. 500 guests, a cathedral ceremony, a reception at the most exclusive country club in Cedarmont Valley. Marcus's father, Richard Blackwell, walked me down the aisle since I had no one else, and for a moment, I actually believed they'd accepted me as family. The honeymoon period lasted exactly as long as our actual honeymoon. 2 weeks in the Maldives, where Marcus spent most of his time on business calls while I read novels on the beach. When we returned to our new house in Willowbrook Estates, a wedding gift from his parents, the real dynamic began to emerge. Diana, sweetheart, Vivienne would say during her frequent visits, don't you think it's time you started thinking about what kind of wife Marcus needs? I mean, this little job at the nonprofit is charming, but Marcus is going places. He needs a wife who can support his ambitions properly. The nonprofit job she dismissed so casually was my work with the Cedarmont Community Development Corporation, where I was already making waves by securing federal grants for affordable housing projects. But to the Blackwells, anything that didn't directly serve Marcus's career was essentially a hobby. Mom's right, Marcus would say later, usually while I was making dinner after my 10-hour workday. I'm up for a promotion to regional sales director. That means client dinners, company events, golf tournaments. I need you available for that stuff. The nonprofit work was fine when we were students, but it's time to grow up. Grow up. As if dedicating my life to helping low-income families access housing and education was childish. As if my master's degree in international development was just an expensive piece of paper. As if the $2.3 million grant I'd just secured for youth programs was irrelevant because it didn't benefit Marcus directly. But I wanted to be a good wife. I wanted to fit into their world. So I started saying no to evening meetings, turned down conference opportunities, and showed up to Marcus's corporate functions in the conservative dresses Vivienne helped me pick out. I smiled when his colleagues' wives talked about their charity galas and country club committees, even though my real work was happening in community centers and housing projects they'd never heard of. When I got pregnant with Melody, everything shifted again. Suddenly, I wasn't just expected to support Marcus's career. I was expected to become the perfect Blackwell family incubator. "This is wonderful news," Vivienne announced when we told them about the pregnancy. "A Blackwell heir. Diana, dear, you'll need to be much more careful now. No more of this running around to rough neighborhoods for work. The baby needs stability." Rough neighborhoods. She made it sound like I was doing something dangerous instead of literally improving communities and changing lives. But Marcus agreed with his mother, and suddenly my pregnancy became everyone's business except my own. "I've already talked to Dr. Morrison. He's the best obstetrician in the state," Charlotte informed me during a family dinner. "And we've looked into nannies. You'll want someone with excellent references since you'll probably want to get back to your activities. Eventually. Activities. Not career. Not calling. Activities like I was a child playing pretend. The worst part was how they made their control feel like care. "We just want what's best for you and the baby," they'd say whenever I pushed back. "We have experience with these things. Trust us." So I did. I trusted them when they said I should. Take extended maternity leave. I trusted them when they suggested I work part-time instead of full-time after Melody was born. I trusted them when they convinced Marcus that my radical nonprofit work might hurt his chances for promotion at Blackwell Pharmaceuticals, the family company he'd joined right after college. By the time Melody was 3, I'd been effectively pushed out of my career entirely. Stay-at-home mom sounded so much more respectable than wife whose in-laws systematically dismantled her professional life, and the Blackwells were masters at making their manipulation sound like generosity. "We're so proud of how you've embraced motherhood," Vivienne would tell her friends at parties, with me standing right there holding Melody. Diana was one of those career women before, but she realized what really matters. Family first, always. Career women. Said like it was a disease I'd recovered from. The breaking point came when Melody was 5 and ready for kindergarten. I'd been volunteering at the community center, keeping my hand in development work, and I'd been offered a consulting position with a firm that specialized in international aid projects. It was everything I'd trained for, meaningful work that would let me travel, learn, grow, and still be home for Melody. Marcus shut it down immediately. "Absolutely not," he said when I brought up the offer. "Melody needs stability. I need support. This family has sacrificed enough for your idealism. It's time to focus on what actually matters, what actually mattered. My work helping refugees resettle in America didn't matter. My expertise in microfinance and community development didn't matter. The fact that I was dying a little more each day in their perfectly appointed house didn't matter. What mattered was being available to pick up Marcus's dry cleaning, host dinner parties for his colleagues, and raise Melody to be the perfect Blackwell granddaughter." That night, after Marcus fell asleep, I sat in Melody's room watching her sleep and made a promise. I would not let them do to my daughter what they'd done to me. I would not let them convince her that her worth was measured by how well she served someone else's ambitions. I had no idea then that I was already sitting on the solution. The divorce settlement I'd negotiated 3 years later, with the help of the best lawyer my community development connections could recommend, would give me something the Blackwells never expected: real money. Enough money to disappear from their social circle entirely while building something they'd never be able to touch or control. Enough money to ensure that by the time Melody graduated from high school, she'd understand the difference between being valued and being used. As I reached the front of the auditorium and stepped onto the stage beside Principal Harrison, I could see Marcus in the crowd, his face pale with confusion. Vivienne was gripping her purse like an anchor, and Charlotte looked like she was about to be sick. They'd spent 18 years treating me like their charity case, never bothering to wonder where the quiet woman in the Honda had actually gone. After the divorce, they were about to find out. Standing on that stage, looking out at the sea of faces in the auditorium, I could trace every moment that had led me here. Not just the 18 years since my divorce, but the subtle, systematic way the Blackwell family had continued to diminish me even after I was no longer legally bound to them. The pattern had started within weeks of our divorce being finalized. Marcus got the house, the cars, and the social connections, but I got something he didn't expect to matter: a settlement that included stock options from Blackwell Pharmaceuticals that had vested during our marriage. Marcus's lawyer had barely fought for those. They seemed insignificant compared to the real estate and luxury assets he was protecting. What they didn't know was that those stocks, combined with my modest savings and the life insurance payout from my parents' deaths that I'd never touched, gave me just enough capital to start over. Not comfortably, not obviously, but with options. The first time they tried to use Melody against me was during the custody negotiations. Vivienne had taken the stand in family court, dressed in her most conservative suit, painting a picture of my instability. "Your Honor," she'd testified with practiced concern, "we're simply worried about Melody's welfare. Diana has no stable income, no permanent residence, and she's made it clear she wants to pursue this international work. That would take her away from her daughter for months at a time." It was a masterful distortion of truth. Yes, I was between jobs, because they'd pressured Marcus to make me quit my last position. Yes, I was staying in a furnished apartment, because I'd given up the house to ensure Melody's stability. And yes, I'd mentioned interest in international development work, because it was my actual career, not some whim. The judge wasn't fooled, but the message was clear. The Blackwell family would weaponize my motherhood against me at every opportunity. So I adapted. I took a safe job as a program coordinator at the Cedarmont Community Center, something that sounded appropriately humble and local. I bought a modest house in a middle-class neighborhood. I drove a sensible Honda and shopped at Target, and I let them think they'd won. The real pattern of exploitation began with Melody's schooling. When she was 7, Marcus announced that they'd enrolled her in Thornfield Preparatory Academy, the C, exclusive private school where all the Blackwell children had gone. "Don't worry about the tuition," Vivienne had said during one of their awkward pickup exchanges. "We know your situation makes things challenging. We're happy to invest in Melody's future." My situation. Code for, "We know you're poor," and "We're being generous by not making Melody suffer for your failures." But here's what they didn't understand. I'd been quietly researching Thornfield Prep for months. I knew their curriculum was outdated, their college placement rates were mediocre, and their prestige was mostly about social connections rather than academic excellence. I also knew that Willowbrook Academy, the newer private school across town, was doing innovative things with STEM education and had just hired away 3 of Thornfield's best teachers. "Actually," I'd said carefully, "I've been looking at Willowbrook Academy. Their programs seem more aligned with Melody's interests." The reaction was swift and predictable. "Willowbrook?" Charlotte had laughed. "That place is barely 10 years old. It has no history, no connections. Melody needs to be around the right kind of families. The right kind of families. Meaning wealthy, connected, and white. Meaning families who would reinforce the Blackwell values and ensure Melody understood her place in their hierarchy." Marcus had been more direct. "Look, Diana, I know you want to have input, but let's be practical. Thornfield is free for us. Willowbrook would cost you money you don't have. This isn't about pride. It's about what's best for Melody. But it wasn't about what was best for Melody. It was about control. About ensuring that even Melody's education reinforced their narrative. Diana is struggling, the Blackwells are generous, and gratitude is the appropriate response. So I enrolled Melody at Willowbrook Academy and paid the tuition myself. Not as Diana Chen, struggling single mother, but through a complicated web of trusts and scholarships that I'd begun setting up the moment my divorce was finalized. The Blackwells never questioned how I could afford it. They assumed I was going into debt or that the school had given Melody financial aid. That's when I realized something powerful. Their condescension was actually my camouflage. They were so convinced of my limitations that they never looked closely enough to see what I was actually building. The pattern escalated with every milestone. When Melody made honor roll, Vivienne credited the Blackwell genes. When she won the science fair, Marcus talked about how his encouragement had motivated her. When she started showing interest in environmental science, Charlotte suggested steering her toward more practical subjects like business or law. They never asked about the hours I spent helping with homework, the weekends we visited museums and nature centers, or the summer programs I quietly enrolled her in. They never wondered how a struggling single mother could afford violin lessons, art classes, and debate team fees. They just assumed their occasional gifts and encouragement were the driving forces behind Melody's success. The most insidious part was how they tried to rewrite history with Melody present. During family gatherings, birthday parties, holidays, school events, they'd tell stories about my limitations right in front of her. "Your mother means well," Vivienne would say, to 8-year-old Melody. "But she's not really equipped to guide you in certain areas. That's why you have us." Or Marcus's favorite, "Daddy's side of the family has all the business experience, sweetheart. When you're older and ready to think about your career, we'll help you understand how the real world works." They were teaching my daughter to see me as the consolation prize in her own life. The loving but limited parent who couldn't offer her the opportunities that really mattered. What they didn't know was that I was documenting everything. Every dismissive comment, every assumption about my finances, every moment they claimed credit for achievements I'd actually made possible. I kept detailed records not for legal reasons, but because I knew that someday, Melody would need to understand the full truth about both sides of her family. The breaking point in this pattern came when Melody was 14 and expressed interest in a summer program at Stanford University, a prestigious environmental science camp that cost $8,000 and was nearly impossible to get into. "Oh, sweetheart," Vivienne had sighed when Melody mentioned it during a family dinner. "That sounds wonderful, but programs like that are for families with different resources. Maybe we can find something more realistic." Marcus had been more blunt. "Melody, you need to understand that your mother can't afford things like that. It's not her fault. She does her best. But we can't all live beyond our means." I watched my 14-year-old daughter's face fall, watched her internalize their message that she needed to limit her dreams to match my supposed limitations. And that night, I made a decision that would change everything. The next morning, I called Willowbrook Academy's development office and made my first major public donation, $100,000 to establish the environmental leadership program that would send 2 students to the Stanford camp every year. I did it anonymously through the foundation I'd been quietly building, but I made sure Melody was one of the first recipients. When she got the call that she'd been selected for the scholarship, the Blackwell family was appropriately amazed at her good fortune. They never connected it to me, never wondered how a brand new program had magically appeared just when Melody needed it. That's when I understood the true scope of what I could do. Not just fund my daughter's opportunities directly, which would raise questions, but systematically build the infrastructure that would give her, and hundreds of other students, access to excellence. They thought they were teaching Melody that I was small. Instead, I was showing her what it looked like when someone quietly changed the world. From the stage of the auditorium I'd funded, looking out at the family that had spent 18 years underestimating me, I felt a calm satisfaction settle over me. Principal Harrison was reading from the tablet, listing accomplishment after accomplishment that bore my hidden fingerprints. They'd spent nearly 2 decades telling my daughter that success looked like their wealth, their connections, their loud displays of generosity. Today, she was going to learn what success actually looked like. Strategic, purposeful, and powerful enough to build the very stage they were sitting in. The catalyst that would ultimately expose everything came in the form of a 26-year-old Harvard MBA named Ethan Blackwell Morrison, Charlotte's son and Marcus's nephew. Ethan had returned to Cedarmont Valley 6 months ago after a stint at Goldman Sachs, carrying himself with the particular arrogance that comes from an Ivy League education, funded by family money, and a starting salary that most people wouldn't see in 5 years. I first encountered him at Melody's 17th birthday party, which the Blackwell family had insisted on hosting at their country club, despite my quiet protests. Melody had wanted something simple, dinner with friends, maybe a movie. But Vivienne had swept in with grand plans about celebrating our granddaughter properly and introducing her to the right social circles before college. Ethan had arrived late, still in his suit from whatever important meeting had delayed him, and immediately commanded the attention of every adult in the room. He was everything the Blackwell family valued, polished, connected, and confident in. His place at the top of every hierarchy he'd ever encountered. "So you're the famous Melody," he'd said, shaking my daughter's hand with practiced charm. "I've heard so much about you from grandmother. Valedictorian track, early admission to Cedarmont. State, very impressive." Then he'd turn to me with that smile I'd learned to recognize over the years, the one that looked friendly but carried an edge of assessment. "And you must be Diana. I feel like I know you already from all the family stories." Family stories. I could only imagine what version of me existed in the Blackwell family mythology that Ethan had grown up hearing. What I didn't expect was how quickly he'd zero in on what he saw as inconsistencies in my life. Where his relatives had simply accepted my struggling single mother narrative at face value, Ethan had the fresh eyes of someone trained to analyze financial situations for a living. "It's interesting," he'd said during dinner, cutting into his filet mignon with surgical precision. "Melody tells me she's been accepted to some really competitive summer programs over the years. Stanford, Princeton, that marine biology thing at Woods Hole. Those programs are incredibly expensive and nearly impossible to get into without serious connections." He'd paused, taking a sip of wine before continuing with casual curiosity. "I'm just wondering how that works, logistically. I mean, Diana, you work at the community center, right? Those programs cost more than most people make in months." The table had gone quiet. This was territory the family usually avoided. The cognitive dissonance between my supposed financial limitations and Melody's obvious access to elite opportunities. They'd always just chalked it up to scholarships and good luck, never asking too many questions because the answers might complicate their preferred narrative. But Ethan wasn't bound by their politeness or their need to maintain comfortable illusions. He was young, ambitious, and had been raised to notice exactly the kind of financial inconsistencies that his family had been willfully ignoring for years. "Oh, scholarships mostly," I'd said, keeping my voice light. "Melody's very talented, and there are programs for students with financial need." "Right, scholarships," Ethan had nodded, but his eyes stayed sharp. "Though some of these programs don't typically offer need-based aid. The Stanford Environmental Leadership Program, for instance. I looked into it when I was consulting for an education nonprofit last year. Very exclusive, very expensive, and they're pretty transparent about being funded through private donations rather than traditional financial aid." He'd done research. This wasn't casual curiosity. He'd actually investigated the programs Melody had attended, probably the moment he'd heard about them. "Ethan, dear?" Vivienne had interrupted with a laugh that sounded slightly forced. "Let's not interrogate Diana about finances at a birthday party. I'm sure there are explanations for everything." But Ethan wasn't deterred. If anything, his grandmother's deflection seemed to intrigue him more. "I'm not trying to be invasive," he'd said, still smiling. "I'm just genuinely curious about how these opportunities come together. I mean, Diana, you've managed to give Melody access to programs that most families with seven-figure incomes struggle to afford. Either you're the most resourceful person in Cedarmont Valley, or there's something I'm missing." The most resourceful person in Cedarmont Valley. If only he knew. Marcus had stepped in then, probably sensing that Ethan was heading toward territory that might upset the family's comfortable dynamics. "Ethan, your curiosity is admirable, but Diana's always been creative about finding opportunities for Melody. Some people are just good at working the system." Working the system. As if my careful philanthropy and strategic giving were somehow a form of clever manipulation rather than genuine investment in education. But Ethan wasn't satisfied with vague explanations. Over the following months, I started noticing him at school events I attended, family gatherings where he'd never shown up before, and even once at the coffee shop near the community center where I sometimes worked late. He was watching me, not in a threatening way, but with the persistent curiosity of someone who'd identified a puzzle he couldn't solve. The moment I realized just how dangerous Ethan's attention had become was 3 weeks before graduation, when Melody came home from a college prep meeting looking confused and slightly upset. "Mom," she'd said, dropping her backpack by the door. "Something weird happened today. Ethan was at school. He said he was visiting to see about alumni outreach programs or something, and he was asking me really specific questions about my activities and programs over the years." My stomach had tightened, but I kept my voice casual. "What kind of questions?" "Like, really detailed stuff. How I'd heard about certain programs, what the application process was like, whether I'd had help with essays or recommendations. And then he started asking about you. How you managed logistics for some of the travel programs, whether you'd ever mentioned knowing people in educational administration." Melody had paused, studying my face carefully. "Mom, is there something you haven't told me?" Because Ethan was asking questions like he thought you were more connected than you've let on. That's when I realized Ethan had figured out enough to be genuinely dangerous. He might not have identified me as the Cedarmont Foundation's anonymous donor yet, but he clearly suspected that the struggling single mother narrative didn't add up. And if he kept digging, if he started making the right connections and asking the right questions, the carefully constructed anonymity I'd maintained for 15 years could unravel in a matter of weeks. But here's what Ethan didn't understand. For all his Goldman Sachs training and Harvard MBA brilliance, I hadn't just been hiding my philanthropy for 15 years. I'd been preparing for the moment when hiding was no longer possible or necessary. Every donation had been meticulously documented and legally protected. Every program I'd funded had been structured through ironclad trusts and foundations. Every relationship I'd built in the educational and nonprofit sectors had been genuine and based on results rather than family connections. Ethan thought he was investigating someone who was fraudulently accessing opportunities above her station. What he was actually investigating was someone who had been quietly building one of the most influential educational foundations in the state. The irony was perfect. The Blackwell family's newest golden boy, the one they'd brought in to represent. Their next generation of success and sophistication was about to be the catalyst for revealing just how completely they'd underestimated the woman they'd been dismissing for nearly 2 decades. As I stood on the stage looking out at Ethan in the audience, his face a mixture of confusion and dawning realization as Principal Harrison continued reading the list of the foundation's accomplishments, I felt a moment of genuine gratitude for his arrogance. If he hadn't started investigating me, I might have continued hiding indefinitely. I might have let Melody graduate without ever knowing the truth about what her mother had built. I might have allowed the Blackwell family to continue taking credit for opportunities I had created. But Ethan's curiosity had forced my hand, and for the first time in 18 years, I was grateful for a Blackwell family member's interference in my life. Because today, his questions were finally going to get the answers they deserved, just not the answers he'd expected to find. The moment of absolute clarity came not during one of Ethan's interrogations or even during the family's usual dismissive comments, but on a quiet Tuesday evening 2 weeks before graduation, when I was alone in my kitchen, responding to what I thought was routine correspondence from Willowbrook Academy's development office. The email had seemed standard enough. Ms. Chen, we're finalizing the graduation ceremony program and wanted to confirm the wording for the recognition of our major benefactors. As discussed, we plan to announce that you've authorized the disclosure of your identity as the primary founder of our scholarship programs. Please review the attached statement and let us know if you approve the language. I'd open the attachment, expecting to see a simple paragraph thanking an anonymous donor. Instead, what I found was 3 pages detailing the full scope of what I'd built over 15 years. Page after page of programs, scholarships, facility improvements, and educational initiatives that I'd funded through the Cedarmont Foundation. The Environmental Leadership Program that had sent 43 students to Stanford. The Advanced Placement Support Initiative that had tripled the school's college acceptance rates. The Arts Integration Project that had brought professional musicians and artists to campus. The New American Scholarship Program that had supported refugee students like I'd once been supported. But it wasn't just the breadth of the programs that hit me. It was seeing them listed together, understanding for the first time the complete ecosystem of opportunity I'd created. Every program had been carefully designed to fill specific gaps I'd identified in educational access. Every scholarship had been structured to support students who reminded me of myself at 17. Brilliant, driven, but lacking the family. Connections or financial resources that the Blackwell family took for granted. I'd built a parallel universe where merit mattered more than money, where potential was valued over pedigree, where students like Melody could thrive not because of who their families knew, but because of who they chose to become. As I read through the document, my phone buzzed with a text from Melody. Mom, I was just looking at college scholarship databases for some friends, and I found something weird. There's a scholarship program at Cedarmont State specifically for Willowbrook Academy graduates interested in environmental science. It's called the Diana Chen Memorial Scholarship. Any idea why it has your name? My heart stopped. Memorial Scholarship. I scrolled frantically through the development office email until I found the explanation buried in the 3rd page. Note: the Diana Chen Memorial Environmental Science Scholarship was established in 2019 through the Cedarmont Foundation. While the scholarship bears Ms. Chen's name, the connection to the anonymous donor was not disclosed until now. Memorial. They'd named a scholarship after me because they assumed I was dead. Because the Diana Chen who'd been married to Marcus Blackwell had essentially disappeared after the divorce, and the quiet woman who worked at the community center seemed like an entirely different person. They'd never connected the 2 identities. I called Dr. Martinez immediately. Sarah, I said the moment she picked up. We need to talk. Did you know about the Memorial Scholarship? There was a long pause. Diana, I was hoping we could address that before the ceremony. When we established the scholarship in your honor, we were working with the information we had. The Foundation's paperwork listed you as the primary benefactor, but you assumed the Diana Chen who was funding everything was someone else. Someone who'd died. The timeline didn't make sense, she admitted. The Diana Chen married to Marcus Blackwell was supposedly struggling financially after their divorce. The Diana Chen funding our programs was making 7-figure donations. We assumed they had to be different people, maybe a relative, Maybe someone with the same name who'd passed away and left money to the foundation. 7-figure donations. I'd never actually added up the total, never wanted to confront the full scope of what I'd given up to maintain my anonymity. But hearing Dr. Martinez say it out loud, I realized I'd essentially funded an entirely new tier of educational excellence at Willowbrook Academy, while letting everyone, including my own daughter, believe I was barely getting by. How much? I asked quietly. Total, over 15 years. How much have I donated? Another pause. Diana, are you sure you want to know? I need to know. $53 million, plus the land acquisition for the new campus, which brings it to roughly $68 million total. $68 million. I'd given away more money than most people would see in 10 lifetimes, and I'd done it so quietly that my own daughter thought a scholarship bearing my name was for someone else entirely. That night, after I'd hung up with Dr. Martinez and sat staring at the development office email for another hour, I finally understood the full scope of what the Blackwell family had cost me. Not just the career opportunities they'd destroyed or the years of marriage where I'd been treated as an accessory to Marcus's ambitions. They'd cost me the recognition for building something extraordinary. For 15 years, I'd let their narrative, that I was limited, struggling, grateful for their occasional generosity, keep me from claiming credit for achievements that dwarfed anything they'd ever accomplished. Marcus made a good living selling pharmaceuticals. Vivienne ran charity galas that raised thousands for causes she barely understood. Charlotte had married well and volunteered at the art museum. Meanwhile, I'd quietly revolutionized educational access for an entire generation of students. The most devastating realization came when I started thinking about Melody's college application essays. She'd written beautifully about overcoming financial challenges, about being grateful for unexpected opportunities, about learning resilience from a mother who made the most of limited resources. She'd crafted a compelling narrative about rising above circumstances, never knowing that I'd actually created most of those circumstances. My daughter saw herself as a scholarship kid who'd gotten lucky. She had no idea she was the daughter of one of the most influential philanthropists in the state. I'd been so committed to teaching her humility, so determined to ensure she understood the value of hard work over inherited privilege, that I'd hidden the truth about my own accomplishments. In trying to protect her from the Blackwell family's entitled worldview, I'd accidentally taught her to see herself as less than she was. That's when I understood that my anonymity hadn't just been about avoiding their recognition or maintaining privacy. It had been about fear. Fear that they'd find a way to diminish my achievements the way they'd diminished everything else about me. Fear that they'd claim credit or find ways to make my success about them. Fear that even my philanthropy wouldn't be enough to earn their respect. But sitting in my kitchen that night, looking at the evidence of what I'd actually built, I realized I didn't need their respect anymore. I didn't need their approval or their acknowledgement. What I needed was for my daughter to understand that success wasn't about inheriting privilege. It was about using whatever power you had to create opportunities for others. I'd spent 18 years letting the Blackwell family control the narrative about my worth. I'd let them define me as limited, grateful, and dependent on their occasional kindness. I'd been so careful to avoid their judgment that I'd hidden accomplishments that should have made them irrelevant. But irrelevant was exactly what they were. Vivienne's charity galas and Charlotte's museum committees and Marcus's pharmaceutical sales, all of it was noise compared to what I'd actually achieved. They'd been playing at importance while I'd been building it. The next morning, I called Principal Harrison and authorized the full disclosure. Not just my identity as the primary benefactor, but the complete list of programs I'd funded, the total dollar amount of my contributions, and the impact those contributions had made on graduation rates, college acceptances, and student outcomes. Also called my lawyer and had him prepare copies of all the foundation documents, donation records, and program evaluations. If the Blackwell family wanted to continue their narrative about my limitations, they were going to have to do it in the face of overwhelming evidence to the contrary. Most importantly, I sat down and wrote a letter to Melody explaining everything. Not just the money, but the strategy behind it. The deliberate choice to remain anonymous so she could develop her own sense of worth without the complicated dynamics of inherited wealth. The careful balance between providing opportunities and ensuring she understood their value. I never wanted you to feel entitled to success, I wrote. I wanted you to earn it. But I also wanted you to understand that true success isn't about accumulating wealth or status. It's about using whatever resources you have to make the world better for others. As I sealed the letter, I realized I was finally ready to stop hiding. Not because Ethan's investigation had forced my hand, but because my daughter deserved to know the truth about what quiet determination and strategic philanthropy could accomplish. The Blackwell family had spent 18 years teaching Melody that success looked like their wealth, their connections, their loud displays of importance. Today, she was going to learn what success actually looked like: transformative, purposeful, and powerful enough to change hundreds of lives without anyone even knowing who was responsible. The week following my awakening, I moved with the methodical precision of someone who'd spent 15 years in the nonprofit sector, managing complex projects and coordinating multiple stakeholders. This wasn't going to be an emotional outburst or a dramatic confrontation. It was going to be a carefully orchestrated revelation that would maximize impact while protecting what mattered most. Melody's experience and the integrity of the programs I'd built. My first call was to Rebecca Santos, my communications director at the Cedarmont Foundation. Rebecca had been with me for 8 years and was one of only 3 people who knew my true identity. She was brilliant at managing public narratives and had been quietly preparing for this moment longer than I'd realized. "Diana," she said when I explained what was happening, "I've been hoping you'd make this call for years. I have the entire media strategy sitting in my desk drawer that I update every 6 months just in case. You've been planning this?" "I've been planning for the day." "You stopped being afraid of them," she said simply. "This story, anonymous philanthropist reveals identity at daughter's graduation after years of family mockery. It's going to be everywhere. We need to control the narrative from minute 1. Rebecca's plan was comprehensive and surgical. First, we'd coordinate with Willowbrook Academy to ensure the graduation ceremony revelation was perfectly timed and professionally executed. Principal Harrison would introduce the concept of anonymous philanthropy, build suspense around the mystery, benefactor, and then invite me to the stage to accept recognition. Simple, dignified, and impossible to misinterpret. Second, we'd prepare a complete media packet that would be distributed to local and education reporters the moment I was introduced. The packet would include my professional biography, the foundation's impact statistics, and carefully selected quotes about the philosophy behind anonymous giving. No mention of the Blackwell family. This wasn't about personal revenge. It was about celebrating educational philanthropy. Third, and most importantly, we'd prepared a comprehensive legal strategy to protect both the foundation's work and my family's privacy going forward. My lawyer, David Kim, had been updating our documentation for years, ensuring that every donation was properly structured and that my transition from anonymous to public giving would be legally seamless. "The beautiful thing," David explained, "during our planning session is that everything you've done has been completely transparent and above board. Every dollar has been properly documented, every program has been established through legitimate channels, and every relationship you've built has been based on results rather than personal connections. You're not revealing anything questionable. You're revealing excellence." But the most crucial element of my planning wasn't professional. It was personal. I needed to ensure that Melody understood what was happening before anyone else did, and that she had time to process the implications before facing questions from family, friends, and media. The conversation with my daughter took place on the Thursday before graduation, in our backyard where we'd had so many important talks over the years. I'd prepared carefully, knowing that this revelation would fundamentally change how she saw not just me, but her entire childhood and education. "Melody," I began, handing her the letter I'd written along with a folder containing foundation documents. "There are some things about our family's financial situation that I need to explain before graduation." She read the letter in complete silence, her expression shifting from confusion to amazement to something that looked almost like betrayal. When she finished, she set the pages down carefully and looked at me with eyes that seemed much older than 17. "You're telling me that you've been secretly rich this entire time?" she asked quietly. "Not rich in the way your father's family is rich," I said carefully. "I've never spent the money on myself. Everything has gone into the foundation, into creating opportunities for students like you." "Students like me," she repeated. "Mom, I'm you. You created most of these opportunities specifically for me, didn't you?" I'd expected this question and had spent days preparing for it. "Some of them, yes. But Melody, you earned every single achievement on your own merit. The programs I funded were available to all qualified students. Your grades, your test scores, your leadership, all of that came from your hard work and talent. But you made sure the opportunities existed in the first place." "Yes." She was quiet for a long time, processing the implications. Finally, she asked the question I'd been dreading. "Why didn't you tell me? Why did you let me write college application, essays about overcoming financial hardship when we apparently had enough money to fund an entire school?" This was the heart of it, the choice I'd made to prioritize her character development over her comfort, her work ethic over her security. "Because I wanted you to understand that your worth isn't determined by your bank account," I said. "I wanted you to develop empathy for people who actually do struggle financially. I wanted you to earn your achievements based on merit, not connections or donations." "But what about all the times Dad's family made comments about money? All the times they acted like they were being generous by helping us? You just let them think they were better than us?" "I let them reveal who they really were," I said. "And I wanted you to see the difference between people who use money to control others and people who use money to create opportunities." The planning session with Melody was crucial because she needed to understand her role in what was about to happen. She would be on stage as valedictorian, giving her speech before the benefactor recognition. She needed to be prepared for the family's reaction, for the media attention that would follow, and for the questions her classmates would inevitably ask. "Are you okay with this becoming public?" I asked her. "Because once we do this, there's no going back to anonymity." "Mom," she said, "I've spent my entire life watching Dad's family treat you like you were lucky to be included in my achievements. I'm ready for them to understand how wrong they've been." The final piece of my strategic planning involved coordinating with the school's security and event management team. Rebecca had worked with them to ensure that media access would be controlled, that the ceremony wouldn't be disrupted, and that the family seating area would be monitored to prevent any dramatic outbursts that might overshadow Melody's graduation. I also prepared contingency plans for various scenarios. If Marcus or his family tried to leave during the revelation, security would ensure they could exit quietly. If they tried to confront me immediately after the ceremony, there would be a designated area where any necessary conversations could happen away from other families and media. But perhaps most importantly, we'd planned for the emotional aftermath. I'd arranged for Melody and me to have a private space immediately following the ceremony where we could decompress before facing any family drama. I'd also prepared responses to the questions I knew the Blackwell family would ask. Questions about timing, motivation, and why I'd chosen this particular moment for revelation. The night before graduation, as I laid out my outfit, the same navy dress I'd planned to wear, but now with a small pin bearing the Cedarmont Foundation logo, I felt a calm certainty settle over me. This wasn't revenge, though it would certainly feel like justice. This wasn't about humiliating the Blackwell family, though their shock would be inevitable. This was about finally, after 18 years of hiding, showing my daughter what it looked like when someone used their resources to build something meaningful rather than just accumulating status symbols. It was about demonstrating that true power didn't announce itself with designer clothes and luxury cars. It worked quietly and consistently to create lasting change. Tomorrow, Melody would graduate as valedictorian from a school I'd essentially rebuilt. She'd be recognized for achievements she'd earned through programs I'd created. And for the first time in her life, she'd understand that the limited mother the Blackwell family had pitied was actually the architect of most of the opportunities they'd praised her for seizing. The planning was complete. The documentation was prepared. The media strategy was in place. Now all that remained was the execution. The morning of graduation dawned clear and warm, with the kind of perfect June weather that made outdoor ceremonies feel magical rather than sweltering. I stood in front of my bedroom mirror, adjusting the small Cedarmont foundation pin on my navy dress lapel, and felt the strangest sensation. For the first time in 18 years, I was preparing to be completely honest about who I was. The auditorium was already filling when Melody and I arrived separately, she with the other graduates for their final preparations, me to take my seat in the designated family section. As I walked down the aisle, I could feel the familiar weight of the Blackwell family's presence 3 rows ahead, but today it felt different. Today, their opinions were about to become irrelevant. Vivienne was holding court with several other families, no doubt discussing the impressive graduation statistics Principal Harrison had shared in the pre-ceremony newsletter. Charlotte was taking photos of the stage and decorations, probably for some social media post about family pride. Marcus sat checking his phone, occasionally glancing around the room with the casual assessment of someone who assumed he belonged at the center of every important moment. None of them had bothered to greet me or even acknowledge my presence, which was typical. In their minds, I was just another parent in the audience, grateful to be included in Melody's achievements, but ultimately peripheral to the real celebration. Ethan sat beside Charlotte, his expression focused and alert in a way that made me think he was still processing whatever inconsistencies he'd discovered in his investigation of my life. He kept glancing back toward my section of the audience, and I wondered if he'd noticed anything different about my demeanor today. I'd spent 18 years perfecting the art of looking appropriately humble at family events. Today, I was sitting straighter, my hands steady instead of nervous, my expression calm rather than anxious. Principal Harrison took the stage promptly at 10 o'clock, his voice carrying easily through the sound system I'd personally funded 3 years earlier. The opening remarks were standard: welcome to families, recognition of faculty, acknowledgement of the graduating class's achievements. But I could see him glancing occasionally at his tablet, and I knew he was building toward the moment we'd carefully planned. Before we begin our recognition of graduates, he said, his tone shifting slightly to signal that something significant was coming, I want to take a moment to discuss what makes educational excellence possible. Behind every successful student, there are teachers, administrators, and families providing support. But sometimes, there are also quiet champions whose contributions make transformational education accessible to entire generations of students. A murmur of interest rippled through the audience. Anonymous benefactor stories were always compelling at graduation ceremonies, but Principal Harrison's tone suggested this would be more substantial than usual. 15 years ago, Willowbrook Academy received its first donation from someone who would become not just our most generous benefactor, but our most visionary partner in educational innovation. This individual has contributed over $68 million to our school. But more importantly, they've helped us reimagine what educational opportunity can look like when resources are used strategically and thoughtfully. $68 million. The number landed on the audience like a physical weight. I could see parents throughout the auditorium turning to whisper to each other, their expressions shifting from polite interest to genuine amazement. In the Blackwell family section, Vivienne had stopped talking and was actually paying attention for the first time all morning. This benefactor has funded the environmental leadership program that has sent students to Stanford, Princeton, and MIT. They've created the Advanced Placement Support Initiative that has tripled our college acceptance rates. They've established the New American Scholarship Program that has supported refugee students in achieving academic excellence. They've funded the construction of our science laboratories, our arts wing, and this very auditorium you're sitting in today. With each program Principal Harrison listed, I could see recognition dawning on faces throughout the audience. Parents who'd wondered how their children had access to such extraordinary opportunities. Students who'd benefited from scholarships they'd never fully understood. Faculty members who'd watched resources appear exactly when they were needed most. But perhaps most remarkably, Principal Harrison continued, this individual has chosen to remain anonymous for 15 years, declining recognition in order to ensure that their philanthropy remained focused on student outcomes rather than donor acknowledgement. Today, for the first time, they have agreed to step forward and accept our gratitude publicly. The auditorium had gone completely silent. This wasn't just about a generous donation. This was about someone who had fundamentally transformed educational access while remaining completely invisible. I stood up. The movement felt both natural and surreal, like stepping out of a role I'd been playing for so long that I'd almost forgotten it was a performance. Around me, heads turned as people tried to understand what was happening. Why was the quiet woman from the middle-class section standing up during the benefactor recognition? As I began walking down the aisle toward the stage, I could hear the whispers starting. Is that Melody's mother? The woman who works at the community center? That can't be right. But 3 rows ahead, I saw the moment when understanding hit the Blackwell family like a physical blow. Vivienne's hand flew to her throat, her face draining of color as she processed what she was seeing. Charlotte dropped her phone, the sound of it hitting the floor echoing in the sudden quiet around their section. Marcus turned in his seat, his expression cycling rapidly from confusion to recognition to something that looked like panic. And Ethan, brilliant, persistent Ethan, who'd been investigating me for months, sat perfectly still, his mouth slightly open, as every assumption he'd made about my financial situation crumbled in real time. I reached the stage steps, and Principal Harrison extended his hand to help me up. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice filled with genuine emotion, "please join me in recognizing Diana Chen, founder and director of the Cedarmont Foundation, whose vision and generosity have made this day possible for hundreds of students." The applause that followed was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. It wasn't just polite ceremony applause. It was the sound of people understanding, for the first time, how the opportunities they'd taken for granted had actually been created. It was recognition not just for the money I'd donated, but for the systematic thoughtfulness with which I'd approached educational philanthropy. But the most meaningful sound was the silence from the Blackwell family section. Complete, stunned silence as they processed the magnitude of their miscalculation. Standing at the podium, looking out at the audience, I could see Melody in the graduate section, her face radiant with pride and something that looked like relief. For 18 years, she'd watched her father's family treat me as peripheral to her success. Today, she was learning that I'd been central to creating the very systems that had made her achievements possible. "Thank you," I said into the microphone, my voice steady and clear. For 15 years, I've had the privilege of watching Willowbrook Academy students achieve extraordinary things. Every scholarship recipient, every program participant, every graduate who's gone on to make a difference in the world, they are the return on this investment. Education is the most powerful tool we have for creating opportunity, and I'm honored to have played a small role in making that tool more accessible. I paused, looking directly at the section where my daughter's father and his family sat in. Shocked silence. I believe that true generosity should be quiet, strategic, and focused on outcomes rather than recognition. Today, I'm accepting this acknowledgement not for myself, but to show young people like our graduates that success isn't about accumulating wealth or status. It's about using whatever resources you have to create opportunities for others. The applause that followed was thunderous, but all I could focus on was the look of amazement and pride on my daughter's face. For the first time in her life, she was seeing her mother not as someone who'd been lucky to be included in her achievements, but as someone who'd built the foundation that made those achievements possible. As I returned to my seat, walking past the Blackwell family section where 4 people sat in various states of shock and confusion, I felt something I hadn't experienced in 18 years. Complete honesty about who I was and what I'd accomplished. The performance was over. The revelation was complete. Now came the reckoning. The rest of the graduation ceremony unfolded in a strange bubble of surreal normalcy. Melody delivered her valedictorian speech, a brilliant reflection on the importance of creating opportunities for others, while I sat in the audience watching the Blackwell family struggle to process what had just happened. Vivienne kept touching her throat and glancing around as if expecting someone to explain that there had been some mistake. Charlotte had retrieved her phone but seemed unable to focus on anything, her hands shaking slightly as she held it. Marcus sat rigid, his jaw clenched, occasionally shooting glances in my direction that looked equal parts furious and calculating. But it was Ethan's reaction that fascinated me most. Rather than shock or anger, his expression had shifted to something approaching professional admiration. The Harvard MBA in him seemed to be running calculations, trying to understand the scope and strategy of what I'd accomplished. Every few minutes he'd lean over to whisper something to Charlotte, probably explaining financial implications she couldn't grasp on her own. When Melody's name was called and she crossed the stage to receive her diploma, the applause from my section was enthusiastic but not unusual. What was unusual was the way Principal Harrison paused to shake her hand with extra warmth, the way several board members smiled knowingly as she passed, and the way the photographer seemed to take extra care with her photos. Everyone now understood that this wasn't just any graduate. This was the daughter of the woman who'd made their jobs possible. The moment the ceremony officially ended and families began moving toward the reception area, the systematic unraveling of the Blackwell family's composure began in earnest. I was immediately surrounded by parents, faculty members, and community leaders who wanted to express their gratitude. Dr. Martinez appeared at my elbow, beaming with pride and relief that the secret she'd helped guard for so long was finally out. Rebecca Santos materialized from somewhere in the crowd, efficiently managing the impromptu receiving line that had formed around me while keeping an eye on the media representatives who were documenting everything. "Diana," said Mrs. Patterson, whose son had benefited from the New Americans Scholarship Program. "I can't believe it was you all along. Thomas always said there was something special about the woman who'd helped him with his application essays, but we never imagined—" "Ms. Chen," interrupted Dr. Williams from the Environmental Science Department, "the Stanford connections you helped us build have been transformational for our students. I've been wanting to thank our mystery benefactor for years." The conversations continued like this, a steady stream of people connecting dots they hadn't even realized were there. The quiet woman who'd volunteered at school events, who'd helped with college applications, who'd somehow always known exactly which resources students needed. Suddenly everyone understood who had been behind the opportunities they'd attributed to luck or institutional excellence. Meanwhile, about 20 feet away, I could see the Blackwell family huddled in increasingly frantic conversation. Vivienne was gesturing sharply while speaking in urgent whispers to Marcus. Charlotte kept showing her phone to various family members, probably looking up news coverage or trying to verify what they'd just witnessed. but it was the steady stream of people approaching them with questions that seemed to be causing the most distress. "Excuse me?" I heard a well-dressed woman say to Vivienne. "You're Melody's grandmother, right? You must be so proud of what Diana has accomplished. Have you been involved with the foundation's work?" Vivienne's response was barely audible, but her discomfort was obvious to anyone watching. We're very proud of Melody's achievements," she managed, carefully avoiding any mention of me or the foundation. The questions kept coming from different directions. Parents whose children had benefited from programs I'd funded wanted to know if the family had been involved in the planning. Faculty members who'd worked with me on various initiatives wondered how long the Blackwells had known about my philanthropy. Board members who'd collaborated with me for years expressed surprise that I'd never mentioned my family connections to the pharmaceutical industry. Each question was innocent enough on its own, but together they created a mounting pressure of social awkwardness. The Blackwell family found themselves in the impossible position of either admitting they'd been completely unaware of my accomplishments or pretending they'd known all along and somehow chosen not to mention that their former daughter-in-law was one of the most significant philanthropists in the region. I watched Marcus attempt to navigate this minefield during a conversation with Dr. Roberts, the head of the science department. "Your ex-wife has been instrumental in developing our STEM programs," Dr. Roberts was saying enthusiastically. "The laboratory equipment alone represents a 7-figure investment. You must have some fascinating insights into her vision for educational innovation." Marcus's response was a masterclass in deflection. "Diana's always been very dedicated to education," he said carefully. "We're all proud of Melody's success. But Dr. Roberts wasn't satisfied with vague pleasantries. I mean specifically, her foundation work. The strategic thinking behind the scholarship programs is remarkable. Did she develop that expertise during your marriage, or has this been a more recent focus?" I couldn't hear Marcus's response, but I could see his jaw tightening as he realized that any answer would reveal either his ignorance of my work or his deliberate dismissal of it. The most devastating moment came when Ethan, who'd been quietly listening to these conversations, finally spoke up during a discussion about the foundation's impact on college acceptance rates. "I think there might be some confusion," he said, his voice carrying the confident authority of someone accustomed to correcting misconceptions. "Diana and our family haven't been in close contact about her foundation work. This revelation is as surprising to us as it is to everyone else." The silence that followed his admission was profound. Parents and faculty members exchanged glances, their expressions shifting from curiosity to something approaching pity. The idea that a family could be completely unaware of such significant achievements by one of their own members was clearly difficult for these education-focused people to comprehend. "Oh," said Mrs. Chen, no relation despite the name, who'd been asking about family involvement in the scholarship selection process. "I just assumed, with Melody being such a direct beneficiary of the programs." And there it was, the question that cut to the heart of everything. If I'd been secretly funding educational programs while maintaining a modest lifestyle, and if my own daughter had been a primary beneficiary of these programs, what did that say about the family members who'd spent 18 years commenting on my financial limitations? Dr. Martinez, who'd been monitoring the situation from across the room, smoothly intervened to redirect conversations away from family dynamics and back toward educational impact. But the damage was already done. The Blackwell family's reputation, in this community, built on assumptions about their generosity, sophistication, and insider knowledge, had been quietly but thoroughly undermined. As the reception continued, I noticed other subtle signs of their social isolation. Conversations that had naturally included them in the past now seemed to center around people they didn't know and achievements they hadn't been part of. Their usual role as social leaders at Melody's school events had been suddenly and completely reversed. When someone mentioned the upcoming capital campaign for the new athletics facility, Vivienne tried to position herself as potentially interested in contributing, only to be gently informed that preliminary funding had already been secured through our established donor relationships. Relationships that clearly didn't include her. When Charlotte attempted to discuss the school's college counseling program, Dr. Peterson politely mentioned that the program's success was largely due to resources provided through Ms. Chen's ongoing partnership with university admissions offices, partnerships Charlotte had no knowledge of and no access to. By the Yao, time families started leaving for private celebrations. The Blackwell family's position in this community had fundamentally shifted. They'd arrived as the wealthy relatives of a successful graduate, expecting to be courted and respected for their potential future contributions. They were leaving as the people who'd somehow failed to notice that someone in their immediate family had been quietly revolutionizing educational access for 15 years. But perhaps the most telling consequence was visible in Melody herself. As she moved through the reception, accepting congratulations and taking photos, her posture had changed. The slight defensiveness she'd always carried around her father's family was gone, replaced by a quiet confidence that came from understanding, for the first time, exactly what kind of woman had raised her. The systematic unraveling wasn't just about their social discomfort or public embarrassment. It was about the complete collapse of the narrative they'd used to define themselves in relation to our family. For 18 years, they'd been the successful ones, the generous ones, the ones with connections and influence. Today, they'd learned they'd been supporting characters in a story where I was the protagonist all along. The first call came at 6:47 p.m., just as Melody and I were sitting down to a quiet celebration dinner at her favorite restaurant downtown. I'd deliberately chosen Bistro Verde, a small family-owned place that served excellent food without pretension. The kind of restaurant that reflected who I actually was rather than who the Blackwell family had always assumed I should aspire to be. Marcus's name appeared on my phone screen, and after 18 years of divorced co-parenting, I knew that tone of controlled fury he was probably using before I even answered. "We need to talk," he said without preamble. "Tonight." "Hello to you too, Marcus," I replied calmly, cutting into my salmon while Melody watched with raised eyebrows. "Congratulations on our daughter's graduation. She was magnificent today." "Don't." His voice was sharp enough that I could practically see him pacing, which he always did when he was trying to control his temper. "Don't pretend this was about Melody. You orchestrated that entire humiliation deliberately." Humiliation. Interesting choice of words for what most people would consider recognition and gratitude. "I accepted acknowledgement for work I've been doing for 15 years, I said evenly. "I'm not sure how that constitutes humiliation, unless you're referring to your own reaction to learning about it." The silence that followed was loaded with the kind of rage that Marcus had always struggled to express directly. During our marriage, this was when he'd start listing my failures and limitations, building a case for why I was being unreasonable. But I wasn't his wife anymore, and his opinion of my choices carried exactly as much weight as I chose to give, which was none. "You deliberately kept this secret to make us look foolish," he finally said. "You let my family believe you were struggling financially while you were sitting on millions of dollars. That's deceptive and manipulative." "I was protecting my privacy and my daughter's character development," I corrected. "But you're right about one thing. Your family did look foolish today. The question is whether that's because of my choices or because of how you've chosen to treat me for the past 18 years. Before he could respond, I heard Vivienne's voice in the background, sharp and demanding. She wanted to speak to me directly, which meant the family had been strategizing about how to handle this crisis to their reputation. "Diana," Vivienne's voice came through the phone with all the authority she'd once used to reorganize my life during my marriage. "This is completely unacceptable. You've embarrassed our entire family in front of the community. Marcus is telling me you've been secretly wealthy this whole time and chose to deceive us about your circumstances." I've been privately charitable, I said, savoring the precision of the distinction. I chose not to discuss my financial affairs with people who had demonstrated they would use that information to judge my worthiness as a parent and a person. Don't be ridiculous. We've always supported you and Melody. The audacity of that statement was breathtaking. Supported us by constantly commenting on my limitations, by referring to my work as a little job, by treating every opportunity Melody earned as evidence of your family's positive influence rather than her own merit? We were concerned about your financial stability. Any reasonable family would be. Concerned enough to investigate, but not concerned enough to actually ask if I needed help. Concerned enough to comment, but not concerned enough to offer genuine support. You were concerned about maintaining your narrative, not about our actual welfare. I could hear muffled conversation in the background, multiple voices talking urgently, about damage control and proper responses. They'd clearly called an emergency family meeting to figure out how to handle the fallout from their very public miscalculation. Charlotte took the phone next, her voice tight with the kind of stress she usually reserved for when her children misbehaved in public. Diana, you have to understand how this looks. People are asking questions about why we didn't know about your foundation work. They're wondering what kind of family doesn't know when someone is making multi-million-dollar donations to their child's school. The kind of family that never bothered to ask what I was actually doing with my life, I said simply. The kind of family that made assumptions and never felt the need to verify them. That's not fair. You deliberately hid this from us. I lived my life according to my values. If that was invisible to you, perhaps you should examine what you were paying attention to instead. The conversation continued in this vein for another 10 minutes. Accusations about deception, demands for explanations, threats about how this would affect future family relationships. Through it all, Melody sat across from me, occasionally mouthing questions about whether I was okay, but mostly just listening to my half of the conversation with an expression of growing amazement. When I finally hung up, she set down her fork and looked at me with something approaching awe. "Mom," she said quietly, "you just completely demolished them without raising your voice once." "I just told the truth," I replied. "The truth is usually pretty effective against people who've been lying to themselves for 18 years. But the phone calls were just the beginning. Over the next 3 days, the Blackwell family's desperation to control the narrative became increasingly obvious and increasingly pathetic. First came the social media offensive. Charlotte posted a lengthy Facebook message about family privacy and how some achievements are better kept within the family circle. She shared old photos of family gatherings, trying to retroactively create evidence of closeness and involvement that had never actually existed. The post attracted dozens of comments from community members who'd been at the graduation ceremony, many of them pointing out that the foundation's work had been public knowledge in nonprofit circles for years. Vivienne's approach was more direct, but equally ineffective. She began calling mutual acquaintances and school parents, attempting to position the family as having been privately supportive of my foundation work all along. The problem with this strategy was that too many people had witnessed their genuine shock at the graduation ceremony. Her attempts to rewrite history in real time only made their previous ignorance more obvious. Marcus took a different approach, one that was both more subtle and more vicious. He began questioning my motives with anyone who would listen, suggesting that my years of anonymity had been calculated manipulation designed to make his family look bad. He painted my revelation as a deliberate attack on their reputation rather than a natural conclusion to 15 years of charitable work. "She planned this whole thing," he told Dr. Peterson during a chance encounter at the country club. "Keeping it secret, timing the announcement for graduation. It was all designed to humiliate us publicly. But Dr. Peterson had worked with me on educational initiatives for years. He knew the difference between calculated revenge and genuine commitment to student success. Marcus," he'd replied, "Diana has been one of our most thoughtful and dedicated partners. Her work speaks for itself. regardless of timing. The most desperate move came from Ethan, who attempted to use his business connections to investigate the foundation's financial structure. He spent hours researching nonprofit regulations and tax documentation, clearly hoping to find some irregularity that would undermine my credibility. When that failed, he tried a different approach, reaching out to other educational nonprofits to suggest that my anonymous giving had been some kind of tax avoidance scheme. This backfired spectacularly when Rebecca Santos learned about his inquiries through her professional network. Within hours, she'd prepared a comprehensive media response highlighting the foundation's transparency, proper legal structure, and documented impact. Ethan's attempts to discredit my work only served to generate more positive coverage about effective educational philanthropy. By the end of the week, their frantic damage control efforts had accomplished exactly the opposite of what they'd intended. Instead of rehabilitating their reputation or undermining my credibility, they'd made their 18 years of dismissive treatment even more public and obvious. The local newspaper ran a feature story about the foundation's impact, including interviews with scholarship recipients and faculty members who'd benefited from my programs. The article mentioned that my ex-husband's family had been surprised by the revelation, which was journalistic code for completely clueless. Education Weekly picked up the story for their newsletter about innovative philanthropy, noting the unusual circumstances that had kept my work anonymous for so long. But perhaps the most telling consequence was how their desperation began affecting their relationships with each other. I heard through Melody, who was still in touch with some family members, that Vivienne was furious with Marcus for not having maintained better communication with me. Charlotte was angry with Ethan for his failed investigation attempts that had only generated more negative attention. Marcus was blaming everyone else for not having noticed what should have been obvious signs of my financial capacity. Their united front against my supposed deception was crumbling as they turned on each other, each trying to avoid responsibility for their collective failure to understand who I actually was. The most satisfying aspect of their desperation wasn't the public embarrassment or the social awkwardness. It was watching them finally confront the reality that their dismissive treatment of me hadn't been based on actual limitations. It had been based on their need to feel superior to someone they should have been respecting all along. They weren't just angry about being blindsided. They were angry about being wrong. And for a family that had built their identity around their superior judgment and social sophistication, being so completely wrong about someone they'd known for 20 years was a blow to their self-concept that no amount of damage control could repair. 3 weeks after graduation, I was sitting in my garden at sunrise, coffee in hand, watching the morning light filter through the oak tree I'd planted when Melody was 7. The tree had grown tall and strong over the past 11 years, its branches now providing genuine shade rather than the hopeful suggestion of future comfort it had offered as a sapling. There was something profoundly satisfying about that metaphor. As I reflected on everything that had changed since graduation day, the phone calls from the Blackwell family had finally stopped. After their week of frantic damage control had only made their situation worse, they'd retreated into what I could only assume was strategic silence. Melody mentioned that she'd received a few awkward text messages from Marcus and Vivienne, stilted attempts at maintaining relationship that carefully avoided mentioning my foundation work or their reaction to it. The messages had the desperate quality of people trying to pretend that nothing significant had happened while simultaneously acknowledging that everything had changed. But the most meaningful transformation wasn't in their behavior. It was in mine. For the first time in 18 years, I was living without the constant undercurrent of defensive anticipation that had shaped every interaction with Melody's father and his family. I no longer found myself mentally preparing responses to their subtle digs about my job or financial situation. I no longer felt the need to dress carefully for school events, striking the precise balance between respectable and humble that would avoid triggering their lectures about knowing one's place. I no longer had to bite my tongue when they took credit for opportunities I'd created or achievements I'd made possible. The relief was profound and, surprisingly, grief-inducing. I hadn't realized how much emotional energy I'd been expending on managing their perception of me until I no longer had to do it. The quiet rage I'd been carrying for nearly 2 decades, rage at being dismissed, underestimated, and treated as peripheral to my own daughter's life, was finally dissipating, leaving space for feelings I'd almost forgotten I was capable of. Pride, for one. Pure, uncomplicated pride in what I'd built through the Cedarmont Foundation. Walking through Willowbrook Academy's campus now, seeing students in laboratories I'd funded, watching them participate in programs I'd designed, knowing that dozens of them would attend college on scholarships I'd created, it felt incredible to finally acknowledge my role in these transformations openly. The campus tour I'd given to a delegation from the state education department the previous week had been particularly satisfying. For years, I'd attended these kinds of meetings as Diana from the community center, offering occasional insights about student needs while carefully avoiding any mention of my foundation work. This time, I'd walked through the school as the person whose vision had fundamentally shaped what they were seeing. The Environmental Leadership Program has been our most successful college preparation initiative, I'd explained to the delegation as we stood in the science wing I'd funded. We've had a 93% college acceptance rate among participants, with 40% going on to pursue advanced degrees in environmental science or related fields. The scholarship structure is particularly innovative, one of the officials had noted. How did you develop the mentorship component? I wanted to ensure that financial support was paired with genuine relationship building, I'd replied. Many first-generation college students need more than money. They need someone who understands the navigation challenges of higher education. The conversation had continued like this for 2 hours, with me openly discussing strategy, philosophy, and outcomes I'd been thinking about for 15 years, but had never been able to claim publicly. It was intoxicating to finally use my voice without disguise or limitation. But the most profound healing came through my evolving relationship with Melody. In the weeks since graduation, our conversations had taken on a depth and honesty that felt entirely new. She'd begun asking questions about my choices that went far beyond the foundation work. Questions about marriage, divorce, career sacrifices, and the long-term strategy behind decisions she'd never understood. "Mom," she'd said during one of our evening walks through the neighborhood, "I keep thinking about all those times Dad's family would make comments about your job or our financial situation, and you'd just take it. I used to think you were being passive, but now I realize you were being strategic. You knew something they didn't know." "I knew that their opinion of me didn't define my worth," I'd replied, "and I knew that their need to feel superior to me said more about them than it said about me. But weren't you angry? Didn't it hurt when they'd dismiss your work or act like they were doing us favors?" This was the question I'd been both expecting and dreading. How do you explain to your child that yes, their family's treatment had been painful, but that the pain had been worth enduring to protect her from more complicated truths? I was angry, I'd admitted. But I was also building something that made their opinions irrelevant. Every time they dismissed my little job at the E-Chi Community Center, I was using connections from that job to identify students who needed support. Every time they acted like they were being generous with small gifts, I was funding programs that would change hundreds of lives. Their condescension became fuel for more strategic giving. "That's incredible," she'd said quietly, "and kind of terrifying. I mean, you basically spent 18 years playing chess while they were playing checkers." The chess metaphor was apt, but it didn't capture the emotional complexity of what those 18 years had actually involved. Yes, there had been strategy and long-term planning, but there had also been loneliness, self-doubt, and moments when I'd wondered if protecting my daughter from the complications of wealth was worth the cost of being consistently underestimated by people who should have known better. The healing process also involved rebuilding relationships within the nonprofit and education communities where I'd worked anonymously for so long. Coming out of the shadows meant acknowledging partnerships and collaborations that had been invisible to everyone except the people directly involved. Dr. Martinez and I had lunch every week now, finally able to discuss foundation strategy openly, instead of through the careful code we'd developed over the years. Rebecca Santos had introduced me to other philanthropists whose work I'd admired from a distance. I'd been invited to speak at conferences about anonymous giving and educational equity. For the first time in 15 years, I was building professional relationships based on my actual expertise rather than maintaining a careful persona designed to avoid questions. The most unexpected aspect of this transition was discovering how many people had suspected the truth, but had respected my choice to remain anonymous. Dr. Williams from the Environmental Science Department admitted that he'd figured out the connection between my volunteer work and the Foundation's funding priorities years earlier. Several board members mentioned that my insights during school discussions had been remarkably aligned with the anonymous donor's apparent philosophy. Even some parents had noticed that the quiet woman who always seemed to know which programs would be most beneficial to their children might have had access to information beyond what casual involvement would provide. "We knew there was more to your story," Mrs. Patterson had told me during a chance encounter at the farmer's market. "But you clearly wanted privacy, so we respected that. It says something wonderful about our community that so many people chose to honor your boundaries rather than gossip or investigate." That observation had stayed with me for days. The community I'd been serving through the foundation had been protecting me even when they didn't fully understand what they were protecting. The respect I'd earned through years of thoughtful engagement had created a circle of trust that had made my anonymous philanthropy possible. As I sat in my garden that morning, watching the sun climb higher and listening to the birds in my flourishing oak tree, I felt something I hadn't experienced since before my marriage to Marcus. Complete alignment between who I was privately and who I was publicly. The performance was over. The hiding was finished. The careful balance between humility and accomplishment that I'd maintained for nearly 2 decades was no longer necessary. I was finally, fully, authentically myself. And that self was someone worth respecting, something I'd known intellectually for years, but was only now allowing myself to feel emotionally. The healing wasn't just about the Blackwell family's recognition of their mistake. It was about my own recognition that I'd never needed their validation in the first place. Their approval had never been necessary for my work to matter, my achievements to count, or my daughter to thrive. I just needed to give myself permission to stop pretending otherwise. 1 year later, I stood in the same auditorium where everything had changed, but this time I was on stage by invitation rather than revelation. Willowbrook Academy was hosting its first annual Educational Innovation Symposium, and I'd been asked to deliver the keynote address about strategic philanthropy and sustainable impact. The irony wasn't lost on me. A year ago, I'd been sitting in folding chairs while my ex-husband's family mocked my dead-end job. Today, I was addressing an audience of educators, policymakers, and philanthropists from across the region about building lasting change through thoughtful investment. Melody sat in the front row, now a sophomore at Cedarmont State University, where she was majoring in environmental science with a minor in nonprofit management. She'd spent her freshman year working with the university's sustainability office, and her insights about student engagement had already influenced 2 new programs I was developing through the foundation. Watching her navigate college with confidence, purpose, and a clear understanding of her own capabilities, rather than inherited advantages, had been one of the most satisfying aspects of the past year. The audience included familiar faces: Dr. Martinez, Principal Harrison, Rebecca Santos, but also new collaborators whose work I'd been able to support openly for the first time. Dr. Elena Vasquez from Riverside Community College, whose innovative transfer programs were helping first-generation students bridge from community college to 4-year universities. James Thompson from the Urban Education Coalition, whose research on educational equity had informed my latest scholarship initiatives. Maria Santos from the Immigrant Family Resource Center, whose English language programs had become a model for integration services throughout the state. These were relationships I'd been building quietly for years, but which had flourished once. I could engage openly as the Cedarmont Foundation's director, rather than simply as an interested volunteer. The professional network I'd been cultivating in shadows was now a visible coalition of changemakers whose work complemented and amplified each other. As I looked out at the audience, I caught sight of a familiar figure in the back row. Ethan Blackwell Morrison sat alone, notepad in hand, his expression serious and attentive. We'd had exactly one conversation since graduation day, a stilted phone call 6 months earlier, where he'd asked if I'd be willing to discuss foundation operations. With him, I'd agreed to meet, curious about his motivations, and had discovered something unexpected: genuine remorse and a sincere desire to understand how he'd gotten everything so wrong. "I've been thinking about that dinner conversation for months," he'd said during our coffee meeting. "The one where I was interrogating you about Melody's opportunities. I was so convinced I was smart enough to see through some kind of deception, but I was actually just revealing how completely I'd misunderstood everything." His presence at today's symposium suggested that conversation had continued his educational process. According to Melody, who still maintained cordial relationships with her father's side of the family, Ethan had started volunteering with a financial literacy program for low-income families. It was a small step, but it represented something I'd never expected from any member of the Blackwell family: self-reflection leading to meaningful action. The rest of the family had chosen a different path. Marcus had largely retreated from community involvement, apparently uncomfortable with the social dynamics that now surrounded any discussion of education or philanthropy in Cedarmont Valley. Vivienne and Charlotte had doubled down on their involvement with traditional charity organizations, the kind of highly visible fundraising that generated social recognition rather than systematic change. They continued to attend the same country club galas and museum benefits they'd always supported, but their role in these events had subtly shifted. They were no longer the sophisticated insiders offering commentary on effective giving. They were simply attendees whose opinions carried less weight than they once had. The most telling change was in how they related to Melody. Their attempts to maintain their grandmother and aunt relationships had become awkward performances rather than natural connections. They still sent birthday cards and Christmas gifts, but the easy assumption that they were the successful side of her family, the side with valuable advice and important connections, had evaporated entirely. Melody was polite but distant, treating them with the kind of respectful neutrality she might show to acquaintances rather than close relatives. "They keep trying to give me career advice," she'd told me after a particularly stilted lunch with Vivienne the previous month. "But they don't seem to understand that I'm not impressed by their version of success anymore. Why would I want to model myself after people who spent 18 years completely missing what was happening right in front of them?" This shift in Melody's perspective had been one of the most profound consequences of the graduation day revelation. She'd spent her childhood accepting the family's narrative that her father's side represented sophistication, success, and social awareness, while her mother represented humility, limitation, and gratitude for being included. Learning the truth hadn't just changed her understanding of our financial circumstances, it had fundamentally altered her assessment of what constituted wisdom, achievement, and moral authority. As I began my keynote address, speaking to an audience that now knew exactly who I was and what I'd accomplished, I felt the complete absence of the performance anxiety that had characterized so many years of my life. There was no careful balance to strike between confidence and humility, no need to downplay achievements to avoid triggering someone else's insecurity, no requirement to make my success palatable to people who preferred me diminished. Anonymous philanthropy, I began, isn't about self-deprecation or false modesty. It's about focus, When you remove the donor's ego from the equation, you can concentrate entirely on impact, sustainability, and the genuine needs of the communities you're serving. I spoke about the 15-year evolution of the Cedarmont Foundation's programs, the lessons learned from both successes and failures, and the collaborative relationships that had made lasting change possible. I discussed the intentional decision to remain anonymous and the eventual choice to step forward publicly. I outlined the philosophical framework that had guided my giving. Investing in systems rather than symptoms, building capacity rather than creating dependency, measuring outcomes rather than counting inputs. But perhaps most importantly, I addressed the question I was asked most frequently at conferences and in media interviews. How had I maintained strategic focus while navigating personal relationships that were complicated by my choice to hide my philanthropy? The most difficult aspect of anonymous giving, I explained, isn't maintaining secrecy from the public. It's continuing to engage authentically with people who've made assumptions about your capabilities and circumstances. It requires accepting that some people will underestimate you, dismiss your insights, or treat you as less than you are. The question becomes whether you're willing to endure that treatment in service of larger goals. I paused, looking out at an audience that included several people who'd witnessed the Blackwell family's reaction to learning about my foundation work. The answer for me was yes, but only up to a point. There comes a moment when the cost of hiding your achievements begins to outweigh the benefits of privacy. When your own daughter starts to internalize other people's diminished expectations of you, it's time to reconsider your strategy. After my presentation, during the networking reception, I found myself in conversations that would have been impossible a year earlier. Philanthropists whose work I'd admired from a distance now sought my insights about effective giving strategies. University administrators wanted to discuss innovative scholarship models. Policy researchers invited collaboration on studies about educational equity and access. But the most meaningful conversation happened with Dr. Vasquez from Riverside Community College, who pulled me aside near the end of the evening. "Diana," she said, "I wanted to thank you not just for the Foundation's support, but for the way you've approached this transition to public recognition. A lot of philanthropists, when they finally step forward, make it all about themselves. You've managed to stay focused on the work and the impact. That's rare and valuable." Her observation captured something essential about how I'd tried to navigate this past year. The revelation of my identity could have become a story about personal vindication or family drama. Instead, I'd worked deliberately to keep the focus on educational equity, strategic giving, and the hundreds of students whose lives had been changed by foundation programs. The Blackwell family's mistake was a footnote to a much larger story about what was possible when resources were used thoughtfully and systematically. As I drove home from the symposium, I reflected on how completely my world had transformed. A year ago, I'd been living a carefully constructed lie of limitation, allowing other people's misconceptions to define the boundaries of what I could say, do, or claim credit for achieving. Today, I was publicly recognized as one of the region's most influential education advocates, regularly consulted by policymakers and practitioners whose work I'd been supporting in shadows for years. The woman who'd sat in that auditorium accepting condescending comments about her dead-end job no longer existed. She'd been replaced by someone who understood that true power didn't require anyone else's permission, recognition, or approval. Someone who'd learned that the most profound changes often happened quietly, strategically, and without fanfare until the moment when silence was no longer serving the mission. I'd built something remarkable while pretending to be unremarkable. I'd created opportunities while appearing to have limited options. I'd changed hundreds of lives while letting other people believe I was the one who needed their help. The performance was over. The real work continued. And for the first time, in 20 years, those two things were finally, beautifully, the same. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.